Asasiya, I want to say welcome. I Never Knew TV. Appreciate you coming up here.
Thank you.
Right. We want to get right into it. Can you please explain the difference between a midwife and a doula and the need for both?
Sure. So a midwife is a clinical provider. One of the main differences is their training, like the depth of their training, the length of their training, and the regulations that govern their practice. So as a clinical provider, a midwife is trained to manage the entire pregnancy experience as well as postpartum. So providing prenatal care, doing clinical aspects of care, delivering the baby, and then doing postpartum care. Whereas a doula, their field is not regulated. So essentially anybody could call themselves a doula, but they're trained to understand, coping mechanisms in labor, how to keep people comfortable. So they're necessary. Both of them are necessary because even in a home birth setting, the midwife is really charged with like the safety and that part of the experience, the clinical part, whereas the doula is more concerned with like moral support and keeping mom comfortable.
And how did you become a midwife?
I went to midwifery school. Yeah. So I would say that, I was a Baha'i, like I grew up as a Baha'i, which is a religious organization. And it's always been in me to want to champion justice. And so trying to figure out what lane that was going to be for me. First it was law, then education. And then I just realized that the best place to start is with the start of humanity, like at that critical stage of gestation where a mom hasn't experienced the bond with her child. And so I felt like midwifery was the right path. So most of us, we start off as doulas because we're just trying to, support people in labor. But the model that I went through is the apprenticeship model, though I went to an actual school. But the apprenticeship model is where someone identifies a midwife and they ask if they can work with them and then they learn under them. So technically I did that, but in an institutional setting. So I went to a midwifery school and did, so we have to do a certain number of clinical hours, a certain number of prenatal, a certain number of births. And I did that on the border, Texas, Mexico.
I read a report by the World Health Organization that stated 2/3 of maternal deaths, newborn deaths, and stillbirths could be prevented if women had support from a trained midwife. Please explain how midwives prevent deaths associated with pregnancies.
Yeah, so the way that midwives help prevent deaths is really the model of care that we engage in. We're very attentive and we're experts in the normal physiological process of birth. And so when you have someone who's really following you and looking at you as an individual, not just numbers, then you can foresee issues that might not be completely apparent on paper, right? So it could be the tension that you feel around birth or life circumstances that we're discussing to help you prepare for labor or the delivery or thereafter. And a critical part of care is the follow-up. So what often happens in the hospital system is that people go to the hospital, not to mention they're often railroaded with interventions without proper informed consent, but then they're sent home and there's not really any follow-up for like another 6 weeks. Then you go back to the doctor or whatever, a nurse might check on you. But with midwives, like we are really there every step of the way, like through the pregnancy, talking to you, addressing certain issues that come up that might be nuanced at the delivery. And then when you're discharged or when we leave your home, we're still coming back for up to 6 weeks, like calling you, texting you, coming by, checking on things.
And I just listen to you, right? Like, what's the thing they call lab coat syndrome or something?
Right, white coat syndrome.
White coat syndrome.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that be heightened during your pregnancy? Like, wouldn't you be more stressed? Because they also talk about the stress and the blood pressure during pregnancy.
Yeah.
But I think naturally, wouldn't that be higher in that environment?
In the hospital environment? Yeah. Certainly, because you already, and then not to mention like for Black women in particular, we have a lot of distrust around the hospital because of things that we've heard, things that we've seen, and then also things that we actually experience with like microaggressions and people making assumptions about who we are, how we got pregnant, our marital status, our level of education, all these things. And so pregnancy is hard on your body as it is, but then to have to experience that kind of stress, it's like a subtle type of stress that can affect you. Certainly. If you think about the most intimate events in your life, whether it's intercourse or even things that are private, if you're doing it in a place where it's very public, like the lights are bright, there are strangers coming in and out. I don't know how G-rated this is, but if you were having, if you were in an intimate moment with your partner, would you rather be, in a sacred space where it feels private and protected, or would you rather like just random people coming in and out the room, switching on the lights, you don't know the people's names? That would naturally cause you to be more tense, right? When you're tense, you're inhibiting the production of oxytocin, which is the natural hormone that your body produces in order for labor to progress. So if that doesn't happen, you tend to stall out, you take a longer time, and then here comes the interventions. When you're in a safe environment, or an environment that you perceive to be safe, you're giving your body the space to, for it to unfold in the process naturally, physiologically.
Could you please explain the different positions used for home births?
Sure. So you can have the standard bed, right, where you have the bed and you can be in a semi-reclined position. You can use that same bed and be on hands and knees, which is like all fours, which also supports gravity. I bring a birth stool, which is, a mobile stool that we assemble and then we set up, which allows you to sit really low where your legs are separated. And so you're using gravity to help bring the baby down. A lot of people decide they want to stand, so kind of standing and leaning on the bed or with one leg up. The water, of course, a lot of people like water births, so you could be in any position in the water as well, as long as your body stays in the water.
So how does that work with the water birth in regards to the child coming out? Like somebody has to catch the child right away, or?
Yeah, so it depends. So a lot of times the mom still wants me to catch, or the midwife to catch the baby. So we're watching and kind of observing, of course, looking for the head. And when baby comes out, usually baby comes up right away. You might see some videos where baby is allowed to stay in the water for a little bit, but generally speaking, baby comes right away. And then sometimes mom just feels it instinctively herself, and she puts her hands there and she receives the baby herself, or the dad.
Many women are kind of pressured and they get in C-sections sometimes, right? Can you break down the business of C-sections for our viewers, please?
Yeah, so the business of C-sections, the reason why in the U.S., and probably in other countries as well, but particularly the U.S., why we have more C-sections is because there are greater monetary incentives to perform a C-section. The insurance companies reimburse physicians at a higher rate for performing C-sections because they're considered more complex procedures. They're major surgeries. And so there's also the risk aversion. Like doctors tend to be very risk aversive. So if they don't have to be in labor with you for a long time and they can do a C-section, even if they find something relatively minute, and if they can get your agreement, they come in with a smile and like, we really think, this is happening. Before you even get a time, opportunity to push back, they introduce the idea and then it's over with, right? So I think that's why, like the risk aversion, the time factors, the bed, trying to get people out, and of course the profitability of C-sections in the hospitals make it so that we have more than what is actually necessary.
Earlier too, it made me think, I never heard anyone refer to C-section as a major surgery, but it is though.
It is a major surgery. Yeah. Like you go through layers of tissue and muscle to get to the baby, then you have to repair that. You have an increased risk of infection, you have an increased risk of blood loss, you have an increased risk of blood clots, your recovery time is longer. So it definitely is a major surgery. It's not something that anybody should just do happenstance. Not to mention that once you have one C-section, more than likely, like the medical world is going to say like you should have a repeat C-section. A lot of them don't even want to give you the opportunity to have a vaginal birth after a C-section. Not all of them, but that's usually the case.
So how does that work on the body with that constant? That's not a lot of trauma to the body?
To have many C-sections? Yeah. Certainly. Most doctors don't recommend that you have more than 3 C-sections. So again, that also limits your ability to reproduce in the way that you might want to reproduce. So the goal is that first child, for it to not be by C-section as much as possible, right? Like sometimes it's necessary, but as much as possible to avoid it. And one good way to avoid a C-section is to not go to the hospital right away when you're in labor. So sometimes people get really anxious when labor starts and they want to go to the hospital and, like, yeah, I'll stay, I'm 2 centimeters. And then you have what they call a cascade of intervention. So you go to the hospital early, You may or may not be in pain. They're like, okay, well, let's just get this. I think that you're in labor. Let's just move it along. And then they introduce the idea of Pitocin, which is synthetic oxytocin, makes your labor contractions much stronger, harder to tolerate. And then you have the epidural. Not to mention that when your contractions are stronger, you're also compromising your baby's ability to deal with that amount of stress. So it's the baby that is often not considered in this process. Like, how is this affecting this human being who's just trying to get here, right? This loads and loads of stress that affect the heart tones. And when you get that drop in heart tones, the next intervention is to do what? Get a C-section. So stay at home as long as possible, labor at home, try the shower at home, rent a birth pool at home, even if you don't plan to push out there, have a doula at home with you. And then once things are really progressing, then that's when you go to the hospital.
Please explain what auxiliary providers are and why they're so important during a woman's pregnancy.
Yeah, auxiliary providers are all of the people that comprise the village of support during pregnancy. That's one way. So you always hear like it takes a village. It takes a village for a woman to have a successful pregnancy and to give birth and to raise a child. And so the auxiliary providers are all of these supplemental providers, the chiropractors, who help to make sure your pelvis is in alignment. Because a lot of us sleep poorly for most of our lives on one side, and then our hip is a little crooked. And then going to a chiropractor can help you so that your baby gets in the optimal position when it's time to push. Or if your baby is breech instead of vertex, a chiropractor can help you with positions to change that as well. An acupuncturist. So if you're suffering with something like anxiety or high blood pressure, before you jump to medications, it might be that your meridians could be a little bit more balanced with the help of acupuncture. Lactation consultants, for obvious reasons, to help with breastfeeding. These are auxiliary providers. Mental health therapists to help with perinatal mood disorders, because pregnancy brings a lot of changes emotionally, hormonally, and sometimes your partner doesn't quite understand, or that's outside of the scope of practice for your midwife even. So yeah, this is the village.
So realistically, right, a lot of people don't have a village while giving birth. So like, are there any artificial supports? I don't know how to say it. Like, if you don't have that support system, like family and friends, is there any other area you can go to get that support system to heighten the success of your pregnancy?
Yeah, like you mean if you don't have it like in your own immediate community? Sure. Like in Philadelphia alone, there's like the maternal wellness village. I have Inner Circle Midwifery and the Doula Collective. And so we are usually a group of women typically who have different specialties and expertise that once you kind of get in the door with one, we spread our arms out to all of the other resources that we have in our network that we can provide you with.
Could you give advice to people for finding a good doula and midwife? Yeah,
so with a good doula, they don't have to be certified, but you want to definitely ask how many births they've attended, the places where they've attended births, where they trained. Talk to the people that they've already worked with, because like I said before, doulas are not regulated. Like anybody could just come up and say, and I've seen this a lot on social media, I call them social media doulas, where they're doulas online, but they don't actually attend births, right?
Isn't that dangerous?
It's not really dangerous because they don't have to do any clinical tasks, but it's a lack of integrity in it because you can't actually be as supportive as you could be, right? Like a good doula understands hospital procedures. And one of the strongest roles that a doula serves in the hospital setting is advocacy, is being able to understand what it means when a doctor introduces the idea of an intervention and knowing what questions to encourage you to ask, and how that might play out if that intervention happens. Like, should you have your water broken artificially? Some people are like, oh yeah, they had to break my water. Sometimes they don't have to break your water because that's an intervention that can lead to something else, like a C-section.
Can you elaborate more on this breaking the water thing when they break your water?
Yeah, breaking the water is something that they do. It's called an artificial rupture of your membranes. So normally when you have contractions, at some point, if it doesn't happen before the contraction starts, the pressure of the contraction just forces the water to break, or the water balloon that the baby is inside of, it opens. right? And the water comes out. Sometimes that doesn't happen and you can be in labor for a while, and then the doctor might, in an effort to make labor progress, suggest that they take a little hook and they hook it inside the bag and allow it to break on its own. And it does oftentimes progress labor, but it comes with other risks and consequences from doing that.
What are some of the risks and consequences?
Infection is one, because now you've exposed the baby to the elements. And so now you're on the clock. So if you weren't on the clock before, now you're on the clock. So, you know, you could be in the hospital for 2 days in labor. If your water is broken, there's no signs of infection, let's rock out. But if your water is broken, they're not going to allow you to labor indefinitely, you know, with that open bag because of the risk of infection.
All right. Finding a good midwife.
Finding a good midwife. My recommendation is, if you're looking for a home birth midwife, that you do get a midwife who is licensed or at least certified, right? And the difference is a national credential versus a state credential. Licensed midwives, they are credentialed by the state, or they're licensed by the state to practice. Certified midwives or certified professional midwives are nationally credentialed to practice, right? And you want that because that means that they're holding themselves to a standard and that they have been trained according to certain standards to keep you safe.
Why do you think so much of our women die during childbirth?
Yeah. Like I said, pregnancy is a very intense process on the body that taxes the immune system, and stress is also, you know, challenged in the immune system. And so if you have all of these subtle forms of stress in the world around you, whether it's economic stress, stress of discrimination and racism, and you're also trying to grow a human being, it just really weathers your body more than the person who doesn't have to deal with that level of stress. And Black women, we are disproportionately affected by society in a negative way. And so I think that that plays a role in our outcomes. And I don't just think it, I know it through studies, right? Because they've done things to look at, like, well, is it genetics? But when they go back and they look at women in Africa, they don't deal with the same types of outcomes that we deal with here, right? And a lot of it has to do with racism and the cumulative effects of racism on our body and our immune system.
What can we do to reduce the amount of deaths during childbirth?
We can take this process of birth a lot more seriously and take our health seriously, not just when we get pregnant, but if you have a daughter, or if you're a young woman or you know young women, to encourage them to start thinking about their diet at a young age. Also to put them in healthy environments, or to not stigmatize mental health. Like, you know, if you know someone needs support, to encourage them to get the support that they need from the time that they are young adults, so that they can kind of approach relationships better, approach their own health better, so that when they are reproducing, that they're coming from an advantageous point.
What are some of the issues you have witnessed people running into who get pregnant at a young age?
Yeah, I want to say this. I want to clarify this. I don't think that I am as concerned with the age. You know, there are obviously biological realities that affect people over the age of 35 and under the age of 17 with pregnancy. But I don't think anybody should necessarily be getting pregnant if they are not prepared mentally, financially, emotionally, because you could be 35 and unprepared to have a baby. You could be 30 and unprepared to have a baby. You could be 18, 19 in a very stable relationship, and it seems like an appropriate thing for you to do is to have a baby. But biologically speaking, under the age of 17, your body is not fully developed yet. Like most young women who are just kind of in their menstrual, like they're just starting their menstrual cycles, they tend to have lower iron levels, and your body demands a lot of iron and blood for you and for the baby. And so younger moms tend to have higher rates of anemia. And anemia, while it can be treated, it can affect breastfeeding. It can affect how you respond to blood loss. It can affect the baby's health. Also, there is a higher chance of the baby being a low birth weight. There's a higher chance of the baby coming too early. There's a higher chance of the baby having a low APGAR score, which means that they don't transition well once they're out of the womb. And then not to mention, you haven't reached your highest level of education. And so your ability to actually take care of a newborn and give that baby the best possible outcome is
And earning
inhibited.
potential.
Yeah, earning potential. Like, what can you actually provide for a child if you yourself are not educated in a stable situation? So there's lots of reasons to avoid pregnancy as a very young woman.
About this placenta.
Yeah.
Can you explain the importance of it?
Well, the placenta is the organ that your body develops to nourish your baby in pregnancy. So it ends up being like about the size of my hand, and it implants itself in the uterus, and it's basically everything to the baby. And what you do can affect how that placenta grows. So what you're eating, how you're exercising, even, believe it or not, how you're feeling, it all affects the placenta, and the placenta is what nourishes the baby. The placenta, like even the amniotic fluid, the placenta, all of it has a frequency to it because it's a material object that has energy. It's, you know what I mean? So the frequency changes based on the frequency around you, the energetic frequency, the nutritional frequency, the exercise that you're doing. So if you're active, you're nourishing the placenta, you're making the baby more apt to be able to endure stress in labor. If you eat well, you're nourishing it properly. If you don't do those things, what you can get is something called placental insufficiency, where the placenta decides, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't even support this pregnancy because I'm either too old, I'm too fatty, I'm too calcified. And so that's when you start to see like the baby have issues with its heart tones. Like a baby's heart tones might get faster, or we might suggest that the baby come out sooner because the placenta has is no longer able to serve its function. So that's like the function of the placenta. I don't know if you're going in the direction of like what to do with the placenta. So a lot of people, once they give birth, people who are in the know, they want to keep the placenta because the placenta is the baby's first home. It signifies that. So in some cultures, they even plant the placenta with a tree that allows the baby to go back, or the family to go back and say, this symbolizes my baby's first home. What they do in the hospital, apart from that whole thing, they tend to detach the baby from the placenta a little bit too early because when it's still pulsing, the placenta is providing nutrients to the baby. It's also minimizing the chance that the baby would have anemia or other, blood issues. So we want to keep the placenta and the baby attached as long as possible while it's pulsating, while there's still communication between the placenta and the baby.